First of all, welcome to this month's lunchtime lecture. And we have Sivaswati with us, who is also known as, quote unquote, the Otterman of Singapore. And I'm really excited because I've watched so many videos of otters in the urban environment of Singapore, and they're all really wonderful. And you will get a taste of it at this talk. And again, thanks to Sivaswati because it's late there and for doing this for the society. If you have questions for him, please put them in the Q&A box, which you can see at the bottom of your screen and not the chat box. So remember the Q&A box. And Danny, who's joined us today, is our education officer. Welcome, Danny. And she will be moderating the Q&A with Sivaswati after his lecture. This is being recorded, and I will be posting little links in chat about our YouTube channel and how to keep in touch with us. And before further ado, I will just introduce him. So Sivaswati has been immersed in mangroves and wildlife for research, tertiary education and conservation at the National University of Singapore since the late 1980s. He also promotes youth development, public education, and environmental stewardship, and is part of a network of wildlife working groups and stakeholder engagements, which mitigate developmental impact. He is happiest when promoting habitat enhancement and community involvement through the 1 Million Trees movement in Singapore. And really, that's it from me. And over to you and otters. Thanks, Sivaswati.
Thanks a lot, Padma. I'm glad to be here to share some stories from Singapore. And let me get started. So when I was doing my research with otters, I was actually spending time in Malaysia and Indonesia because they were missing in Singapore from the 60s. And they returned in 1998 and they reared pups. But first, let me just clarify, in Asia, there are 4 species of otters, right? The Eurasian otter ranges from, the UK all the way to Thailand. But in Singapore, there are only 2 species, and the most common being the smooth-coated otter, which is what the rest of the talk discusses. And then there is a rarer species, the small-clawed otter, which we are quite concerned about in Asia because it is not as adaptable to urbanized waterways as the smooth-coated otter is. So Singapore is at the tip of peninsular Malaysia, and its size, it's just 57 km by 28 kilometers. So you can walk across the island, even though you might get quite well sunburned. It's quite hot now. So how did the otters return, given that they were missing for about 3 decades? And the source of that was actually Malaysia. So there are green areas in Malaysia where otters were still found. And as they reproduced and dispersed for various reasons, some of them found their way to Singapore. So first to the Sungai Buloh Wetlands Reserve, and then also in the northeast through 2 of our islands. Right. So if you look at a map, then you realize, okay, both Singapore and Johor, which is in Malaysia, are quite urbanized, but nestled amongst them are these green areas. So that's where wildlife would have persisted. And amongst these forests and wetlands, there were 2 species of otters, and they made the crossing to turn up in Sungai Buloh Wetlands Reserve, right? So then the question was, will they be restricted to just the mangrove reserve, right? And I must cast you back to Singapore in the past, where rivers were terribly polluted. So at the point of independence, they were black rivers. But since independence, a system of parks and nature reserves had been set up, and effort to make this connected for people and wildlife. And waterways had been cleaned very aggressively and very intensively for a decade, where the Singapore River was completely cleaned up. So what was a dead river became a living river. But these were waterways and urbanized because they were for flood control and for reservoirs for drinking water. But this is my school, and it was a dead river. It was completely anoxic, but now the water is clean. So the waterways are clean, right? So then the question would be, could the otters disperse because is there food in these waterways that were clean only for a few decades. Now, when we talk about food with otters, typically then this has been a great resource, which are springs, right? So this is what the otter will defecate in a prominent location because it also defecates some pheromones, which are used to signal to other members, females and males in the area. And this has a record of the kind of fish that they would be eating. So my first very brave student went through and sorted through Spain's and tried to figure out the kind of diet that they were engaged in. And interestingly, where there were prawn ponds in the area, then there would be some proportion of diet that revealed that they were eating these large prawns, but the rest of it was fish. And then in natural sites, as opposed to waterways, the diversity of fish they were feeding on was much more diverse. Now, these waterways, these are modified areas, right? So they're not natural, and they are actually well stocked with fish. Now, most of them are actually exotic. Some were introduced during the war. Others had come through the trade or released by anglers because they are good sport fish, right? And you can see that anglers are able to take in quite large fish, right? So they essentially, when the otters returned to Singapore, then there was this buffet table, right, loaded with fish of the right size that they happily fed on. So that was good. There was food. Now, otters can't live by food alone, so what else was needed? And these are resting spaces to simply to rest from their activity, but also to dry their fur, which is quite important, right? So this is otters just drying themselves on some turf next to a river. You can see canoes in the river, and the otters are drying their fur. Right now, these are just handphone photos, so you can see they are well habituated. And then there was this, Singapore is known as a garden city, so there's a lot of planted trees, and they do maintenance of the trees. And when they started mulching them actively, it turned out the otters just loved it because grass doesn't dry their fur as well as the mulch. And they were able to use all sorts of urban spaces. So under nooks and crannies of bridges and around buildings, there are actually a lot of spaces that simulate a normal kind of resting place, where an area would narrow into an alcove that they can use, right? So they were extremely adaptable, and I laugh because we used to make all kind of measurements in the field about what's a suitable hole, and the otters were most concerned with just a space to rest. They'd use anything. Now, this boldness turns out that not every family is bold, but some will be friendly, some will be indifferent, some will be shy. And this is how bold they were to just lie down in the open. So it boggled my mind because in the 90s, I had hunted for them in Malaysia and Indonesia, and they were quite elusive. And here they were happily sleeping in the sun in an open space, right? So this is, of course, a great delight to photographers, and they are able to actually provide very detailed photos of a wide variety of behaviors and morphology, right? This is just at the edge of a river, right? So it's just adjacent to Singapore River, and they've all settled down for a rest because they are essentially like biathletes. They are swimming and they're running, and they get exhausted. There was once we tried to return a pup to a family, and I called out to them uh, to make sure they would receive the pup, and they didn't stir. So they're really exhausted and they sleep very deeply. So with the habituation and the proximity, it's good because the otters are in the water, people are on land, and there's usually sort of a distance between them. So they were able to observe them at a distance. But here you see people have all backed off, right? Actually, there's a secret ingredient in this picture, and that's that of the otter watchers. So they provide advice because in Singapore, a lot of people are urbanized, nature deficit. They're not familiar with even free roaming dogs, and some even don't even know how to handle cats because of decades of separation. So they actually have to learn how to just enjoy a wild animal from a distance. And with the handphone, you are tempted to go closer because the zoom is not so strong. So the advice of the community has been really helpful, right? And so lots of people have come out to enjoy them, and they are really well loved, right? But it had been quite important to set up this framework of rules so that we were able to coexist. So at this stage, in the first they rose to prominence in like 2014, and so for about the six years, it was quite smooth sailing, right? And of course, then people ask us how many otters are there, and of course we go and count. So the first student who put together a distribution was Merrill, and you can see initially they settled in Sungai Buloh in the northwest. Then we got sightings in the northeast, more and more sightings, and they eventually made their way down south. And you can see this little space here in the south. That's right next to the city center. So when there's a typical photo of Singapore being a highly urbanized city center lit up, right, at night, it's actually from this area, right? And this is like the tourist spot for everyone. And that's where they turned up, 2014 in February, right? And so then people begin to realize they were present because they were right in their face, and then celebrated their presence. But when we started counting, so this is Max, he was an energetic young man, so he wanted to count and verify and every family, right? And at that time, it was at least about 70 plus individuals in 11 groups. So it was possible. But when we redid, we conducted another census, and this time it was by Anusha, and she tapped the otter watching community. So about 12 of them, they realized that for research purposes, a lot of rigor was required. So they were very patient and submitted a lot of records so that she was able to triangulate the photos and videos. And she got a reliable count of at least 170. So we are going to conduct the next census, and it's going to be really interesting. So we pushed out these maps, which give people an idea of where they may be found. But even though Singapore is small and there are 170 otters, it can be quite a task to find them. So when my students initially start to work on otters, they will pound the cement for quite a while until they begin to see and appreciate their movement patterns, and then it becomes more predictable. But for many people who've come, and we see these complaints on Facebook, I've come, I see all these wonderful photos, but I've been unsuccessful. Can anyone give me tips? So from the community, you can get an idea, but if you go out and walk around Singapore, it's not that easy, right? Because this is still a big space. Now, let me just mention the small clawed otter, which is short clawed otter, which is rare in Singapore. And so while the smooth coated otter is widespread, the small clawed otter, you can see it's been detected here. And some years ago, it's also detected in this. So these two islands, which are close to Malaysia, is where they are believed to be present still. Okay, so with the smooth-coated otters right there in front of us, it's a wonderful opportunity to learn about otter ecology, right? So our friends who study otters really have to work hard to figure things out. And but here, we just sat down and watched as they woke up to head out for breakfast. And this was quite interesting to me because when I looked for otters in the 90s, they were nocturnal. And I thought otters were nocturnal species, but we found that in Singapore they are diurnal. So they must have been avoiding interaction with man or possible conflict. So in Europe now they are beginning to realize, yeah, a lot of these otters in areas where they are free of persecution, and as they return, they are spotted during the day. So this was fascinating as well because I read accounts of it and it was now unfolding in front of my eyes. These formations that they adopted when they were hunting, right? So they would use it to herd fish into the shallower end. And then they'll be able to pick them off more easily. So this is a wonderful photo. And you can see that they had moved the fish from a deeper end of the canal to a shallower end. And as the fish struggled and moved about, they were able to feed very effectively. Now, interestingly, a lot of our fish are cichlids, right? So they are quite big, between 15 to 30 cm, and they're very fleshy. And then to us, the fish head would be the last thing you tackle, but for them, it's the first. And you can see with their very sharp carnassials, they just slice through the fish head, right? Except when it's a catfish. And then they will eat that very carefully, tail first. And a fisherman will tell you how hard the skull of a catfish is enough to have them uh, begin to eat it from a different direction. So then I had another student, Tina, and she looked like she wanted to weep when she was going through the sprain. So I said, okay, since you're getting all these good photos, why not you set out to observe and take photos, and then by using estimation methods from known lengths of objects in their surrounding, you'll be able to estimate species and length. And so you can see that a lot of the fish, well, almost all that are depicted here are exotic. Some had been around for half century or more. Others are more recent occurrences. And you can see the size range of what they would pick up. So there's an optimal size, but then they have on occasion picked up fish as large as 60 centimeters, right? So, okay, there's a lot of food, there's resting spaces, they're able to hunt effectively. And then what about the size of the families? So in literature previously from friends in India, Hussein, and these were relatively small families, but these were river systems with maybe less fish biomass. So here, well, it could be also that the number of places to disperse to may not be has been abundant. So for whatever reason, the otter family sizes started increasing, right? And you can see, it started with two individuals of four, and then it goes up to six. This was in the west, and then in the east, the size increased, and it's hit 26, right? Can you imagine a family of 26 moving about? Right? So then comes the question, can these families coexist? So they are in the waterways, right? And they are beginning to get really close to each other. And well, they are social carnivores, so they are territorial and they will fight. And look at where the battleground is. So this played out under the eyes of the otter watchers, the naturalists, well, even the locals and the tourists, because that battleground is where everyone goes, right? There's a high visitorship, there's a lot of tourist sites here, and under their noses, there were fights, right? So in territorial battles, you see that formation again, right? The same thing they use when they organize a hunt. But right now, the vocalization was much more aggressive. And here you see two families, well, one family driving off another family. They would disappear around the corner and continue to fight. So this, when we observed it over a long period, we realized that when otters raise pups, the home range of the family was reduced to a much smaller area. So Bishan 16 at the time, right? So this was 2018. Bishan family had 16 individuals and they had withdrawn to Kallang Basin, right? So the whole area is their home range, but when they're raising pups, so only the mom is with the pups, but the rest of the family will stay around her. So their hunting ground gets exhausted as they stay in the area. Um, and while they had reduced that home range, then the Zook family comes in to raise pups, right? But when the pups emerge, right, So after about 2 months, they can swim. Then the original territory owners will recover their home range, and then they will drive out the rival families. So there was this temporal situation to be able to snatch a space in which to raise pups. Um, and that was how they were using, or they were found in similar areas. If not, they would have been driven out. And tragically, of course, these are the victims of territorial battle. So in many that we have observed, it normally ends with one of the pups getting killed. And you can see here, this was from a student of mine who had received the carcass at the museum and then detailed the bites. So that must have been a terrible way uh, to die. So the territorial battles are sort of the precursor of otter problems that you find in a human modified landscape, right? So it's an urban area. Very close by will be traffic, right? So it's Singapore. There's no real hinterland. You're in a natural setting, a mangrove, and then within 5 minutes you could be confronting a car. So this was along East Coast Road, and the male was returning to the family where they had raised pups, which the Otter Waters were keeping an eye on. I mean, we put up signs and all that, but signs are not that effective at managing traffic. So they do run the gauntlet on a regular basis. And then we have picked up roadkills. They now go to the zoo where the zoo vet is a pathologist and he will do the autopsy of causes of death, right? And this is not uncommon in Singapore. So there are many species. Once they radiate out of the core areas that they are in, then they are bound to face traffic, right? So what about rescues then? To interfere or not to interfere? And we've been guided. So when I say we, I mean the Otter Working Group. We've been guided by um, actually a longer history of dealing with wildlife, especially urban birds and long-tailed macaques, right? So that there is an understanding about when to interfere. But sometimes, if the interference is caused by men, you see the public will call for help. So this was an otter that was seen in the northeast, and everyone said, "Look, there's a metal wire cutting into the body. Surely you can help." So we went down, we grouped together, and this is a good introduction of Otter Working Group. You can see that there are people from many different elements. So there is the government agency that handles wildlife, so that's NParks. There is ACRES is a wildlife charity, right? Which is involved in animal rescue and animal welfare issues. And you have the zoo. So the vets with who had the dart guns, right? You're not going to be able to handle dart gun in Singapore easily. So they have got that set up. And so enclosure was set up by NParks. There were people who had set this up for dogs, right? In remote areas. And so they deployed it for otters. The otter watchers had been tracking the family, so we knew which was the best site to do it in. Then the zoo vets came in to do the darting, to treat the animal, and eventually, after release, the otter watchers were able to monitor it and saw that it reunited. So we are really, really thankful. But this took a month, for us to figure out the whole thing together. And the thing is, when we have this many otters in urban spaces, right? We see the harshness of nature. So there have been situations in which a pup is abandoned, right? And when taken in, we find that there may be congenital problems, or there's that big uh, dilemma. Do we try and rear it? But you can't raise this alone. It's a social species, and they'll scream their lungs out until they can get reunited. But sometimes the parents have rejected it. So there are all these sort of situations to figure out. And so there is a difference between what might happen in the wild, where it's really, which is going on now, right? All the time, when animal that is unable to keep up will die, right? Then there is animals in captivity in zoo, which will be scrutinized in great detail, right? And then you have the urban environment, which is sort of a mix of these two situations. So we've had to work out how we are going to manage these kind of situations after being challenged many times by these situations. And it's unique to Singapore. So when we reach out to our colleagues around the world, then they are quite befuddled by these questions because they're not really having a situation which is similar to ours, right? So human-wildlife conflict was expected to happen, right? And initially, it was just eating koi. Well, we say just eating koi because no one really gets hurt except the fish. But to the fish owners, some of them have been keeping them for a decade or two, and it's like a morning ritual to wake up, feed the koi, which comes to them, right? So koi are like they are really just pet fish, and they are in ponds which don't have a three-dimensional texture, so there's no escape, right? The whole idea is that they are seen prominently, and the fish will approach you because they are fed. So then that's a happy situation. But that happened in the absence of an amphibious predator. So now that amphibious predator was around, people discovered with great shock that their entire collection of fish might get wiped out. So it's very shocking to them. I mean, the cost was one thing, right? Then interestingly, some of these koi owners dismiss the suggestion that, of course, the internet is full of exciting ideas, but they dismiss the suggestion of culling because through their appreciation of their pet, they had some appreciation for nature. So I was very struck by the empathy that they were able to share. And then the media started to, you can see like the first incidents were happening almost a decade ago. So more recently, when the media portrays it is if there's something amusing about the angle. So, a family dog doesn't protect the fish and then it gets mileage. But actually, people in Singapore don't realize, they think the otters are far away in Singapore River, but there's a whole network of drains and canals, which means that an otter could come quite close to you without you realizing it, right? So you can see here in the most recent, in the 2022 piece, right, you can see that there's now advisories about how to prevent otters from coming into your space. So interestingly, during the COVID years, we saw this increase, right, in reports, which were suggesting that people are having difficulties. We do realize that, because everyone was restricted, unable to travel and all that, reports of various kinds of interactions went up during that period, right? And when you examine the reports, you find that a lot of it is simply just citing, I've seen an animal. So I guess they were at home for longer hours and were realizing that in their neighborhood were things which they never thought would be near. And then the conflict situations were kind of low key. There were some regarding fish, but a lot of it was entry into private estates. So condominiums have increased in number, and they have water features or swimming pools, and they'll find otters turning up to take a swim. So that was one source of conflict, right? But this contentment was still at a very low percentage. So I had students go and examine this. They looked at one family. They was frequenting the city in a highly urbanized space, right, along the Singapore River. And then we identified the areas of what we call hot zones. So these are zones of interaction where the otter is in very close proximity to people. And then what sort of behavior was the otter exhibiting? And you can see it's mostly neutral. So they're habituated, they ignore people, they treat them as part of the surrounding. And there was no incidents of aggression. So, okay, we thought this was reassuring, right? But then there's a difference when they have pups, and their tolerance for proximity is lowered greatly. So this is individual who ignored the advice of the otter watchers and went close to the riverbank where a family with pups was moving, right? And thankfully, he's quite athletic. So the parents see him, and you can see he's squatting, and they rush out at him. But he's a really good dancer, so he avoids any injury, right? And this would happen. People will ignore advice because they see otter as some cute furry thing, and they're just swimming peacefully in the distance. But it all is different if they have pups. So yeah, the media got very excited about a lot of reports, and there was one in particular of a gentleman who was in the Botanic Gardens, and this was early morning before it's fully lit, and he was really unfortunate because someone else ran over some pups, and the parents lunged out, and he was there. So and he stumbled and falls. So then they start to pepper him with bites. And it must have been really traumatic for him, right? So then we realized, okay, we can't just give people advice and all that. We're going to have to take active steps, right? So interestingly, in one space, you can see from the photo below here, you see a pair of otters and they are on a pavement. So this is a pedestrian pathway. And you can see it's on either side, there's soil. So the otters are really excellent excavators. So they dig holes into the to create a burrow, and then they raise pups there. So this was unusual, right? And I'll come to that later. Why were they rearing pups in what was really a terrible space? There wasn't a lot of fish around. The neighborhood had koi ponds, but they don't really like koi. And that place was, at human traffic, and adjacent to it was multiple lane roads. So this was not really an ideal situation. And someone actually was bitten. He turned out to be a primary school friend of mine. So he just went and got himself treated without raising a fuss. But this was a situation in which we had to relocate the otters, right? And when sentiment gets really hot, and this has happened twice, when there's a lot of debate and discussion and all that, and then the government comes out and says, look, we got to learn how to coexist. So in Singapore, there is actually a Singapore Green Plan 2013, which sets a series of targets on sustainability, targets that we want to achieve by 2030, right? But it's a living document, so it's going to continue, right? So it's really shifting the baseline on what we're able to achieve. And of the 5 pillars, the first one is city in nature. And it does include this idea of human-wildlife coexistence. So we have greened the country, we've cleaned the waterways, but in the meantime, you have an urban population that was working hard and don't have a familiarity with wildlife like people in the 60s. And so they would need to learn about coexistence. So it's not something that can be achieved passively. It require active effort by people. So as people call and ask for help, there are various avenues. And ACRES, the wildlife charity, and NParks, the government agency, are at the forefront of this. And we all work together to try and help resolve issues. Now, the interesting thing is, as the population grew, right? So it grew from 79 to about 170 plus, and it seemed like it was about the number that we could hold. So that appeared to be the carrying capacity. Then these very large families started breaking up. So they are no longer, there's only one group which is large, in that number 20, and the rest have begun to split up. So another student examined this area. So you can see there's the Sungai Punggol, and Sungai Serangoon, which empty into a reservoir, right? So these are two waterway systems. And this was the family that dug a hole in the pavement of the neighborhood, right? So why were they going into this neighborhood, which is a suboptimal habitat? And that's due to competition in the waterways, right? So you have 5 resident families, right? And she counted 8 unconfirmed families. So there are groups of otters, maybe they are transient, maybe they're dispersing. She can't even be sure of counting double because they were fleeting. It's hard to see them clearly in this particular environment, but there's very active dynamics. In fact, she walked so much, she lost 5 kilograms just trying to track all of these families. So it would appear that as the carrying capacity was reached, then competition got heightened, then subordinate groups would have to disperse. And if it's an area without a suitable habitat, they would have to keep searching. So they enter an urban matrix and they were checking out the neighborhood and they found the koi ponds and they decided that's where they're going to try and survive, right? So these are the otters that were under the pavement, and we had to work together with the MP who was getting a lot of feedback from the residents, together with the agencies, the wildlife charity, the university, and I'm quite pleased with this award because we really had to go beyond the science, right? Science alone is not enough, right? We needed all sorts of other skill sets, and collectively this was put together. And my 2 students there was a 3rd year and a 4th year student who did their research projects in this area. They were there to help receive the award. I wasn't there, but they, photoshopped me into the photo. So I was quite pleased with this because the authors are helping to educate our science students into the broader scheme of things. So authors are authors. We have difficulties, we overcome it. So the very important thing is to keep up our education and our outreach. So we work with other nature groups in Singapore, and there's a festival of biodiversity. It's held every year in around May at the school holidays, and it's done in areas where a lot of people will be present. So these are like shopping centers, and we'll set up booths. And the nature community understands the kind of messaging that we need to help urbanized people get used to wildlife in their midst, as well as to be able to appreciate it. So we've all come together, and there's a portal called Our Wild Neighbors, and you can see that there's a whole bunch of species there. And these are the ones that, from feedback, are the issues that people have some kind of difficulty with. And so there's comprehensive material from experience as to what people require explanations about, right? So I hope you found that interesting. It's been an education. The authors continue to reveal new things to us. So thanks very much for listening. I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful, Saraswati. And it was quite amazing to see that you were obviously, there were a lot of problems that was thrown at you, but that there is a way out of these. And what was interesting, I think, is that Singapore, of course, is a petri dish for, you have limited land and you have limited resources in a lot of way. And this conflict, and once you intervene, you have to keep intervening, I feel, particularly in human animal relationships. I have one question before we move on to Q&A, which Danny will moderate. Is that, did you feel once, while you were sensitizing Singaporeans about how to live with otters, how to coexist, do you feel that it was also a gateway to sensitizing them to biodiversity in general? Would you feel like that if they focus on one species, but that you can move on to the ecosystem in general?
Well, the reverse is true. So we've been trying to introduce Singaporeans to biodiversity in their midst. And then the otters became a subset of that. So generally, there's quite a lot of interest. There were conservation issues in the 2000s, which many people were keen on. It was a national discussion about a marine site, and thousands of people came to visit the site, something unheard of in the 80s. So there's a natural shift in the economic status of people where they will return to nature. And then secondly, the government infrastructure to establish this series of parks and park connectors actually was a hit of use, right? So it was set up as part of, a livable city concept. So when COVID came and people couldn't travel, but they could move around their neighborhoods, they flooded these spaces. And you could see these were new to these spaces because they didn't know how to behave. They go off trail, they want to pluck plants and leaves and all kinds of things. So I think the general interest in nature had been heightened,
Yeah.
which is kind of a natural sequence. Then nature needs to be close to you. And because we are a city state, right? So there's no hinterland to travel to. So it has to be close to us at our doorstep. And we also need to mitigate the paralyzing effects of urbanization. So you need green spaces around you. So it's that confluence actually probably helped. The tolerance and appreciation, I would say appreciation more than tolerance. Also, a lot of people take the advice. It's relatively
Yeah.
easy to explain to people. Yeah. But I must say with otters, right, because they are amphibious, being in the water, they are mostly at a distance away. That makes it easier. There's been a lot more challenges with long-tail macaques because that
Yeah.
you got to realize don't display food, don't offer food, never feed, and we actually had to change wildlife laws to be able to enforce restrictions on deliberate feeding. So a wandering macaque going through your neighborhood is heading to another green space to hopefully look for a troop. But if someone feeds, that's the end of its movement. And even if 99% of the neighborhood is knows what to do, that 1% would just result in conflict.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, a parallel from London would be foxes, which would be a very different set of behavior and a very different set of responses from the public as well. But I'm not going to take up all the time. I can see that there are a lot of questions in Q&A. Danny, take it away.
Okay. Well, first off, talk was great. I wish that, especially here in the UK and Ireland, we could roll out some of the attitudes and responses to urban wildlife. Because, yeah, Irish people have problems with gulls and seals that I think we could take a lot of inspiration from Singapore and how to coexist with them. So the first question is from Andy. So they say, do the otters prey on nesting birds, and is this an issue for bird conservation?
No, so the UK otters are slightly different. They are a bit more terrestrial in their feeding habits, so they might take wild birds, but the smooth-coated otters are fish-eating specialists.
Okay, cool. And then the second one from A. Kelly. So what type of family structure do the otters have? So is it a case of, is there an alpha male and female who are the only pair that breed? Or do the males chase away male cubs once they reach maturity? So they just want to know what happens with those otters.
So typically it's a alpha male and an alpha female, but we've seen incidents where a second female will raise pups, and the parents don't chase the maturing litter, so the litter stays, and that's why we've gotten very large groups. And I think well, we haven't really seen the interactions as to when the large groups undergo fission, which is going on now.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I just had a follow-up question to that. So do the older siblings say do they help their parents with the younger pups? Or are they
Yeah,
all
there is some
okay?
help. They sometimes help with the swimming or the feeding. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then we have a question from Dennis about postmortem. So when the postmortems are carried out, in addition to finding the cause of death, do you also make other health checks? So such as checking for general conditions, tick infestation, liver flukes, heavy metals, etc.
Yeah, it's quite a comprehensive examination, but we don't do heavy metal analysis. So the pathologist will give a rundown of the animals' health. Normally, in the case of roadkill, they're healthy, but the X-rays are depressing. Yeah.
Okay. And then let me see. So we have a question from Esther, who is working on the same problem for their masters. So are the otters in Singapore a subpopulation, or have they just adapted to the urbanized environment?
Sorry, are they what?
Are they a subpopulation, I guess, of the broader population of smooth-coated otters, or have these ones just adapted to the urbanized environment?
So the source would have been Malaysia, and then we are the sink.
Okay.
But how many times there was immigration, we don't know. So there are people who want to study the genetics and sort that all out.
Okay, cool. I'm just seeing if there's any more questions. So just if anyone has any other ones, if you want to throw that into the Q&A box, that'd be great. Let me just see. I guess I had a question, like when you're talking about the cichlids and that a lot of the fish are non-invasive or are non-native, are they causing any ecological problems themselves?
Well, the exotic fish are in the canal system. So in Singapore, most of the streams are canalized. But in the center of Singapore, where there's a forest reserve, you get the natural forest streams. And so these fish can't survive in there. They're too small. These are more like lake fish. And they would face competition from natives. So there isn't really a situation on invasives in natural water bodies. These are all modified environments.
Okay, cool. Let me just see. I think that's it for the Q&A boxes. Last chance. Anyone wants to add any other questions?
I thought I'd give a shout out to the Otter Watchers. So these are members of public. I don't know how they figured out work-life balance, but they are avid photographers and they can follow the otters closely. So all of my students have had the help of these uncles and aunties who are out there and who share their worldly wisdom with my students, who in response are also sharing with them the rigor of the scientific work that they have to do.
Thank you so much, Sivaswati. That was really great. I have pasted a link for our upcoming events, and this beautiful presentation will be up on our YouTube channel very soon. And Sivaswati, as I said, I'll be in Singapore next week, and I hope I see some otters for sure. But
We can
thank you.
arrange it.
Yeah. But thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of the week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Good night or good afternoon to all of you.
Yeah, good night to you.